Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. It's getting close to Halloween, or at least I'm hoping that I release this just before Halloween, and so I thought I'd do another video about monsters. I like doing videos about different monsters. I've done a few, including alternative random encounters in Curse of Strahd, monsters from Tome of Beasts that are very good for a Ravenloft campaign, some of the monsters from the new 2024 or 2025 monster manual, things like that. And I don't know about you guys when you DM, but when I'm thinking of monsters to include in a campaign or a Domain of Dread, I go to the usual places. I go to the Monster Manual, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and possibly the Bestiary in Curse of Strahd as well. And then also things like Vola's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, some of those monster books. But sometimes there's great horror and Ravenloft-friendly monsters buried away in other 5th edition books, even those that aren't really horror or that aren't really horror campaigns or stories. So what I've done, because I own a whole bunch of other non-Ravenloft D&D books, is I've dug out 7 from my bookshelf, and I'm going to choose my favourite Ravenloft-friendly monster from each of them. And the 7 books, it's a mix of source books, but also adventure books, whether they be a book that's one big adventure, like Curse of Strahd, or you've got some of the ones more recently where they can be run as one campaign, or you can just use individual chapters as one-shots. And the list is Candlekeep Mysteries, Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen, Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, Journeys through the Radiant Citadel, Quests from the Infinite Staircase, Vecna Eve of Ruin, and Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. As I said, I've chosen one from each, except for one book where I couldn't narrow it down to one, so I've narrowed it down to 4. I couldn't even narrow it down to 2 or 3. So there's 4 from one book and 1 each from all the others, plus honourable mentions from a bunch of them as well. So each book I might mention multiple monsters. Just a warning that there is spoilers for any of the 7 books I talk about, especially the adventure ones. I might talk about a monster that, if you're a player or hoping to be a player in some of these adventures in the future, you know, might be giving away the secrets. So just please bear that in mind. I also don't know if all the books are still available to buy physically in print. I found out recently that Ghosts of Saltmarsh is now out of print. You can no longer buy it anymore, which is a shame. And so apologies if any of the books I cover are unobtainable now, but there's always things like D&D Beyond and things like that. And before I move on with the list, this video isn't sponsored, but I promised a friend I would say thank you and name drop them. So I've got plans at some point to do a Ravenloft actual play, very early stage, it's probably going to be months away if it happens. And a friend of mine called Angel, he's the DM of Darkeport Productions. Darkeport Productions do a bunch of actual plays, one of which they're actually doing at the moment is Curse of Strahd. And they not long reached Vallaki and have met Rictavio and got on hold of the Tome of Strahd. And I picked Angel's brains asking for advice on how to run an actual play, and he's a really busy guy, but he took time out of his schedule to reply, answer my questions. So as a thank you, I said I'd name drop him and Darkeport Productions at the beginning of some of my videos. And so if you're looking for a Curse of Strahd actual play to watch, I recommend that. Okay, on with the list. Let's start with Candlekeep Mysteries. By the way, I've got some of the books here, actually, in person, so if you see me looking down, I'm not staring at my crotch, I am looking at the book. And my choice for Candlekeep Mysteries is the Corrupted Avatar of Lurue, assuming that's how it's pronounced, which basically looks like this evil, shadowy unicorn. Now, what Domains of Dread would something like this work well? Well, the Shadowlands, which I'm hoping to run soon, is essentially Ravenloft's answer to Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, and I believe in the old King Arthur legends, unicorns appeared or were mentioned, and so having an evil unicorn certainly makes it very Ravenlofty. Another option could be Darkon. I remember seeing people saying that Darkon, out of all the Domains of Dread, feels the most sort of traditional D&D, thinking things like Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk. And I'm sure that somebody was discussing the kinds of monsters you'd find in Darkon, and a unicorn was one of them, so having an evil sort of corrupted unicorn could work well. I'd also like to point out, while I'm thinking about it, Tome of Beasts has its own version of like an evil, spooky looking unicorn called a Shadhavar, so you could potentially use that instead, or both. Why not both? Use both. The honourable mentions from this book are Shemshim. I love that art, that is so cool. This was actually originally going to be my main choice instead of the Corrupted Avatar of Lurue, but I got kind of confused by the whole thing about how it can only be killed if they're crushed by an object weighing at least 1,000 pounds. And I'm not familiar with the adventure, but it makes you think that, you know, do you have to sort of get a piano to fall on his head like out of the cartoons? But I still think, you know, you could potentially use it without that stipulation. and I just think the art for it is cool. It kind of reminds me of Shadows, that kind of thing. For those who are running giants in Ravenloft, I don't think there really are giants in Ravenloft other than the occasional NPC. I don't think there's like a domain of giants or a Dark Lord who's a giant, but there is a Cloud Giant Ghost and Storm Giant Skeleton stat blocks in there as well. And there's a Lichen Lich as well, which is essentially when a druid becomes a lich rather than a wizard becoming a lich, which looks and seems really cool. Next up is the Dragonlance book. Now, I got this after reading the Dragonlance Chronicles trilogy. I read a bunch of the Ravenloft novels and then moved on to Dragonlance. And a connection between the two is our good friend Lord Soth. Lord Soth is a character who originally appeared in Dragonlance who also had their own domain once upon a time in older versions of Ravenloft, and was in two old Ravenloft novels as well. And my choice, it's got to be done. My choice from Dragonlance, not Lord Soth, who's got a stat block in this, but my choice for the spookiest, most horrifying monster in the Dragonlance book is, of course, the Kender Skirmisher. I am joking. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Having read the Dragonlance novels, you kind of get a feel for what the Kender are like, and how sort of they're essentially like halflings who are obsessed with exploring and have a strange understanding of what possession means, and essentially little kleptomaniacs. And I'm reminded, it's one of my favourite ever quotes from any book I've ever read, from the first Dragonlance novel: "The cruelest form of torture one can inflict on a Kender is to lock him up." Of course, it is widely believed that the cruelest form of torture one can inflict on any other species is to lock them up with a Kender. I think that's brilliant, and I just wanted to drop that in. Sorry, I'll stop being silly now. My main choice is the Anhkolox, if that is how that's pronounced. Anhkoloxes, I'm reading from the book, are undead creatures created from the bones of bears and other beasts. I love the art for them as well. And places where they would work in Ravenloft, well, the Mordia, maybe their failed experiments of Victra Mordenheim, or in Markovia as well. Maybe some of the animals have gone funky, and this is the result of what happened to them. My honourable mentions, like I said, I'm not including Lord Soth and some of the other Dragonlance NPCs that appear, but I was also drawn to the Death Dragons. Their art looks amazing. I love it. And also Skeletal Knights as well. The Skeletal Knights serve Soth, and they're sort of like stronger variants of things like wights and skeletons. It's worth mentioning as well that there's also Ghost Knight from Tome of Beasts, which is similar. You can potentially mix and match them, and you've got like two very similar varieties. Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. Now, my immediate choice for this was the Ghost Dragon. As soon as I was looking through it and saw Ghost Dragon, I thought, hey, there we go, undead, ghostly dragon, that seems perfect for Ravenloft. And once upon a time, when I ran Curse of Strahd, I was going to plan to have Argynvost, who's the deceased dragon who Strahd defeated centuries earlier, even before he became a vampire. I was going to have him return as a ghost dragon that the players would have to fight. But somebody recently, and I can't remember where this was, I got a feeling it was a YouTube comment on one of my other videos. Somebody drew my attention to the Hollow Dragon, and they said it's basically like the Revenant of dragons. And obviously Revenants play a big part in Argynvost. So I do really like the idea that you have these Revenants, but then Argynvost, instead of being a ghost dragon, is a Hollow Dragon instead. So Hollow Dragon is my main choice, and my honourable mention is Ghost Dragon. Journey through the Radiant Citadel. This doesn't strike me as a very Ravenlofty book, but there was a few monsters when I was reading through it going, wow, okay, you know, they could work. And my main choice from this is the Soul Shaker. It's essentially like this sort of massive limbs, and even in the art it's showing them trying to grab a raven. That's just Ravenloft, Ravenloft, Ravenloft. You're ticking all my Ravenloft boxes. Where would a Soul Shaker work? Well, for Coveney it makes sense. And in Van Richten's guide, you've got the swarm of zombie limbs, so you could have like a Soul Shaker and various swarms of zombie limbs as like additional minions. That could be quite interesting. Or Lamordia as well. Maybe they are another failed experiment by Victra, or maybe she kept some limbs on standby and this happened to them. My honourable mentions from Journey Through the Radiant Citadel are the Haint, which is essentially a ghost that can transform how it looks. It shifts from its spectral form to appear as the corporeal humanoid it was in life, passing as a living creature. That is very cool. And my other choice as well, right near the back of the book, is called the Whistler, an aberration that stalks people, and they go all blurry, and one of their attacks involves them whistling telepathically, whistling an otherworldly melody into the minds of creatures. Now, I recently put out a video about evil NPCs, like minor, non-Dark Lord NPCs you can add to a Ravenloft game, and I talked about the Whistling Fiend. And I think for that I recommended the Babau stat block, because it is a Babau, it's like a type of fiend, a demon, I think. But I wish I'd seen this, because this would be really good for the Whistling Fiend, the Whistler stat block. So if you saw that video, and you might include the Whistling Fiend in the future, maybe consider this stat block instead. Next, we have Quests from the Infinite Staircase. I love the artwork for this. I love the cover. That's amazing. This is one of those, similar to Tales from the Yawning Portal, if you're familiar with that, where it's kind of like 7 adventures, I think, that are like from older versions of D&D, older editions, I mean, that have been updated for 5th edition. And some of them are quite quirky. One of them, I think, is in a spaceship. I struggled to choose which one for this one, but I ended up going for, they're called Gibberlings. Gibberlings are little fiends, demons, babbling, hairy creatures, dart about, attacking whatever they can find. And you can get them in swarm variants as well. It says in their information the 2 places they like to dwell in are dense forests or the Underdark. Underdark makes me think Blurtzburg could be a choice, because that's like Mind Flayer territory, and I understand a lot of it is sort of underground. If we're talking about forests, there's quite a few options there. There's Tempest, Cartacus, I believe Isle of Ravens in the Sea of Sorrows is supposed to be a forested island. And the Shadowlands I mentioned earlier as well has got patches of forest. I'm not sure how the kind of creature it is would fit with those different domains, but, you know, could be things to consider. And if you open up to Rainforest as well, you've got Kalikari and Valachan as well, but I don't know if they fit either of those. But see what you think. My honourable mentions from Quest from the Infinite Staircase. My first one isn't a monster, it's an NPC called Drelnza, and it's a vampire with a sword. Now, if I was only just introducing the Kargat in my Ravenloft game now, the Kargat being the vampire secret police from Darkon, I would probably consider this for Alcio, who is a sword-wielding vampire. I think when I did it, I just used the sort of, I can't remember what it's called, Vampire Warrior stat block maybe? The one that is basically vampire with a sword. But if I were to do it again, I'd probably use Drownz's stat block because it looks really cool. There's also horrid plants. There's 3 varieties. Some do acid attack. Some is like slashing damage from their spiky leaves, and one of them does necrotic damage. I mean, I'm thinking of places like Ivana's home in Borka. I think there's dangerous plants mentioned in the information for Ikath, and Valachan as well. Makes perfect sense. And lastly, there's Nafik or Nafik, which is a high priest who is now undead. Immediately gives me Harakir vibes. Vecna, Eve of Ruin. This is the one. This is the one where I struggled to choose one and have chosen 4. Because I just couldn't decide. There's so many good Ravenloft-friendly monsters in this. I do know there's obviously, Ravenloft is incorporated a little bit into this, so it's only natural, but some of the other monsters tied to some of the other settings just struck me as possibilities for Ravenloft. There is a bone rock. So for those familiar with Curse of Strahd, there's the rock at Selenka Pass. The giant bird. There's a skeletal variety, and it even gives suggestions of what kind they could be. They could be giant owl, they could be a rock, but they could also be a giant owl, a periton, axebeak, and others. Something like that could be consideration for Forkovnia, maybe, as well as zombies. You've also got a bone rock, just to add to the terror even more. There's a Deadbark Dryad, love that artwork, which is essentially a Dryad who fails to protect its wilderness home from a great evil and is unable to forgive itself. I do like Dryads. I don't think I've ever run one, but to have one that's a much higher challenge rating with evil is great. Where would this work? Well, Forlorn was my immediate thought. I ran Forlorn a few months ago for my players, and Tempest as well springs to mind. There's the Deathwolf, which is essentially like a werewolf that's undead. So many choices for this. There is Lemordia. Perhaps it's an experiment that Victor tried and this was the result. There's Volkovnia with VEoR. I played VEoR very differently to how he's talked about in Van Richten's guide, but in Van Richten's guide it says that he tries to sort of make people super soldiers by injecting them with lycanthropy. Maybe it kills some people and turns them into undead werewolves. And Cartacus, known for its werewolves, could be an option as well. And my 4th choice from Vecna, Eve of Ruin is the Relentless Impaler. Now this has got to be a follow-on from, in fact I'm reading the book and it says, in the domains of dread, blah, 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 blah. So it's, you know, they've introduced a Ravenloft creature into Vecna, Eve of Ruin, because in Van Richten's guide there is the Relentless Slasher and the Relentless Juggernaut, and this is the 3rd version, which is an even higher challenge rating again. When I ran Valachan, I had Chikuna be a werepanther but mixed the Were-Tiger stat block with the Relentless Juggernaut. If I'd known about Relentless Impaler, I probably would have used the Relentless Impaler instead and made her even more powerful because my players are quite high level. And it just looks cool. And I'm mentioning it mostly for people who don't realise that there's a third version, because if you've got Van Richten's Guide, you know about the first two. You may not know they made a third, and it's stronger, and here it is. So my suggestion for that would be Valachan. And my one honourable mention, because I couldn't say I had 5 choices, I had to say there were 4, is the False Lich. A False Lich, which is essentially a copy of a Lich. And it's almost as powerful as a Lich. It's almost the same challenge rating. But you could have that for if you're running somebody like Azalin Rex. Maybe they find a False Lich first that they think is Azalin, and it's not Azalin. And last but not least, Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. To be honest with you, if I had never become a Curse of Strahd DM and started Curse of Strahd videos, I probably would have started a YouTube channel about this. Because when I first got this book, bear in mind I've not run it, I was a player in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which kind of comes before it, but this book, it blew me away, seeing all like the many layers and levels of dungeon, and I was just like, wow, love to run a mega dungeon like this one day. Anyway, when I was looking through this, there was only one real choice, but I thought it was quite handy under the right circumstances. In the monster manual, there are shadows, and in this, there is the Shadow Assassin, which I don't think has its own art. So it's not like it's got its own art, but what you could use is like just the art for shadows, but they're essentially a much stronger version of shadows. They're a challenge rating 9, and they have a shadow blade attack instead of whatever shadows do, which I'm going to put up in front of me, which I'm assuming they just kind of like hit you or something. They hit you, like swiping like a kitten. And so if you wanted an assassin, I've had Darkless Rex from Darkon try and send assassins after Franz Alhonen as part of the build-up to the end game of this arc of the campaign that I'm running for my players. A Shadow Assassin could make sense there. Or maybe you could be really cruel and you got a higher level players and they see a room of shadows and they're like, oh, we fought these guys before. We fought them at like level 3 and they're not too bad. And then they're actually like loads more powerful than their Shadow Assassins. Or maybe it's a Shadow Assassin with Shadow Minions, that kind of thing. And that's it for this one. What did you think? What are your favourite monsters from some of the sources I said? Do you disagree with any where I said an honourable mention? Perhaps you think the honourable mention is better than the main suggestion I made. Are there other 5th edition books that can secretly contain great Ravenloft flavoured or Ravenloft friendly monsters that I haven't covered here today? I don't own all the 5th edition books, and in fact the 7 I've chosen sort of at random are basically books that I already own, but there might be other books that contain great Ravenloft monsters that I haven't talked about today. Please do mention them. Might be useful for me, and my campaign might be useful for other people watching this. Upcoming videos, I think Hazlan Part 1, all going well, touch wood, is going to be my next Ravenloft video. As I record this, they've probably got 1 session left before they go to Hazlick's tower to face off against Hazlick. And so I'll do a video of everything up to the tower, and then do the tower as a separate video following on probably a few weeks or a couple of months later. And then just more Ravenloft stuff, more Curse of Strahd stuff. On the Ravenloft stuff, I have teased with the idea of doing more Domain of Dread videos, even domains I don't plan to run. I did Lemordia. It's a lot of work coming up with all the information. So, the maps, the music, the monsters, the adventure ideas beyond what's in Van Richten's Guide. What I do really like is finding and amassing monsters from different sources and throwing them in, because Van Richten's Guide assumes that you only have access to the monster manual and Van Richten's Guide is a minimum, and so the choices of monsters are quite limited. So I like saying, if you're running Tempest, for example, or Borka or whatever, you could use these monsters from Tome of Beasts, and these monsters from Mordenkaim's Tome of Foes, and these monsters from some of the 7 books I just mentioned. So expect more videos like that. So I don't, instead of covering off a domain entirely, I'll just say, here are some great monster suggestions for this domain beyond what's in those. So I'll probably do more of those in the future. And that's it for this one. Happy Halloween if you watch this when this comes out. Otherwise, happy whatever day you're watching this on. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers.